Commerce and Economic Development. It is Friday, February 2nd, 2024 at 1:05 in the afternoon. So we're here now to have another chat about H666 and to see hopefully we can get through this and pass that bill this afternoon. So have with us our legislative counsel. John, welcome. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you, guys. John Gray, Office of Legislative Counsel. Just pulling up the Zoom as we speak. I am muted. All right, excellent. My main goal each time. Perfect. So I did switch from to a strike through, striking out all. So this shows the entirety of the text, but I've highlighted the particular pieces that are new here. So my understanding is that there was a request based on Mara from VHFA's testimony to limit this to individual accounts. So that's what the edit to this first section is. This is just renumbering because I wanted to add a subdivision A2 to say that any deposit available for withdrawal under subsection B, that's our construction costs withdrawal. Any deposit available for withdrawal under that subsection shall be placed in an individual escrow account. I did want to maybe try to get some context as to why this request was made. I wasn't here for the testimony. I did watch, but just to explain how I understood the concern to be, VHFA receives funding for a particular program that it does. I don't know the eligibility conditions based on accruals of interest in certain escrow and trust accounts that are deemed not likely to generate much interest. They take the interest that accrues and it's put toward a particular program, and those are pooled accounts. They're not individual accounts. Separately, deposits that a broker might have could be put into individual accounts. This would be on the basis that they are expected to generate substantial interest, and you might want that interest to remain with the purchaser who made that deposit. So if the idea was to protect that VHFA funding stream, I don't think that that's what this does. What this does is it mandates that any of these deposits be placed in an individual escrow account, which means that it therefore would not be available to generate any interest in that pooled account. There's also a question empirically as to what the current conditions are. So are you modifying anything by doing this? If it turns out that currently these deposits are currently put into a pooled account to generate interest, and now we're mandating that they put in individual accounts, you actually are subtracting from that VHFA revenue stream, conceivably. And that's just a question as to whether or not things would be working that way. If that's not the case, if they're already held in individual accounts, what this would do is just clarify that that is the case. And so it would just be clarificatory language. But it does ensure that there is no possibility that these enter a pooled account from which VHFA could draw that interest. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Did I misunderstand something? Yeah.
Well, I don't think that it's only under this scenario of allowing a surety bond to be used that we would want that to be only in individual accounts and not the pooled accounts. So we want to still maintain the ability for pooled accounts. But under this scenario, it would be only the individual accounts that could, instead of being an escrow, could be used and then.
Right. So this is set up just to apply to the funds that are used for construction costs. That's what's available for withdrawal under B1. But what I would say is that if folks are depositing an amount and then the bonded amount is less than that full amount, and now they're being placed in individual accounts, there may be amounts remaining that are generating interest that are now guaranteed not to be part of a pooled account. Which would mean that there's no. So I guess I could see this as a consumer protective piece saying we want to make sure that folks are receiving interest on their accounts to the extent that they can, if not all of the funds are withdrawn. I don't see this as aiding VHFA, but again, maybe I'm just a cloudy brain today.
I was thinking back on what Maura said, that their funds that are in those pooled accounts are not deposits from a homeowner. They're the deposits that they receive from grants and other places.
So let me go to this. Here's what I see under, this is 26 VSA 2214. This deals with real estate brokers. So this is the deposits that brokers make. And if you go to see if a deposit is not reasonably expected to earn a substantial amount of interest, the broker shall place the deposit in a pooled interest-bearing trust or escrow account and direct that interest be remitted to the HFA.
My understanding was that those pooled accounts were for, were lesser amounts, so.
That's right.
Right, so for, less expensive, homes that with the deposit wasn't necessarily, like, wasn't big enough to maybe make a individual, because these are all short-term things, right, during the course of the purchase and small amounts for a shorter term, and so it wasn't efficient to put the
Right.
deposit into a separate account. And so from those pooled accounts is where it came this small stream of money, and I think she said $36,000.
That's right. That's right. That sounds consistent with what I recall, and I think that the point she was making about why new developments might be more likely to be in those individual accounts is that they occur over a longer time frame. It's not just for closing purposes, that these are deposits made for construction, so it could occur over a longer period, and then the expectation might be in those instances that they're more likely to generate interest, substantial interest, in which case they would already be in the individual accounts. So what this language would do is just say definitively that's what's going to happen. They will be in those individual accounts.
All deposits.
Any that are being made available for withdrawal for construction purposes. So not, this section applies more generally to these communities, but it applies. So this wouldn't, the mandate to deposit these funds into individual escrow accounts would not apply to deposits made in connection with purchase or reservation that are not being made available under this subsection B. But in the context of any that have this surety bond set up to allow withdrawal, if they're being made available for that purpose, those would all be included in individual accounts under the current drafted language. So I guess I just wasn't sure what we were trying to achieve. Like, what's the goal in including this language? Is it clarity or is it preservation of funding streams? Because I will just say this doesn't enhance or preserve any funding stream to do this. As I understand it, this just guarantees that it doesn't.
I think the thought was that we want to make sure that those smaller deposits where the interest gets sent to VHFA is preserved.
So that should be preserved, and nothing about the setup prior to the addition of this new highlighted language should affect that, is I guess what I would say. If we're talking about deposits being made and the funds are being withdrawn, those are not available to generate interest in the first place, assuming none is left over. And if there is some left over, perhaps that generates interest, but that's not pulling away a stream, as I understand it. And then, yeah, I don't see how this aids VHFA, I guess.
It's not necessary that we.
I don't think it's necessary, but I also just feel like I'm missing something that you guys are seeing.
I'm wondering if we can leave this language out and then get a report from, or add to whatever report the HFA does, if there's any decrease or change, like how their funding pool has changed 1 year after this law is in place, so that we don't give so much time that, and just like get a regular report from them rather than adding language in that we don't know what the unintended consequences could be.
I don't believe that there's a way for a developer to access those funds that are in those pooled funds unless they're being used to purchase one of those units, right?
Right, that's right. Maybe that's where I'm misunderstanding. You're right. You're saying the risk that I was not understanding is that there's a pooled account, these funds are put in, and somehow they sort of overdraw and end up taking those other funds. They can only withdraw up to the amount of the surety bond. There is no risk under this that they're withdrawing additional funds. I mean, you could say that funds are fungible, so in the sense they might literally be claiming what was deposited by someone else, but an equivalent amount that would be included in that deposit would remain. So they can only withdraw up to that surety bond. That is what protects the limitation on overdrawing. And that's irrespective of any inclusion of this highlighted language.
Yeah, the only time that they would be able to withdraw funds out of the pooled funds would be if the deposit amount is gonna be de minimis enough for it to be put in that pooled account. Right?
That's true also. They're only going to be withdrawing from the pooled account if it was allocated there in the first place, which is presumably made on the basis of that statute that we just looked at, which is expectation of not substantial interest.
So good to walk through this whole process. So any developer that wants to use this new tool that we're proposing here, they number one have to get a surety bond. Has to be large enough in order for them to make it worthwhile. And so $5,000 deposit is not gonna cut it. And we're talking about big deposits that would be in individual accounts anyway.
And again, the ultimate protection is that the withdrawal is only up to the amount of that surety bond. So,
They're not gonna get a surety bond for $5,000 or 10,000 or even 20,000 probably. These are gonna be deposits that are gonna be pretty large in order to make it worthwhile. Because they wanna use this instead of going to the bank and
Right.
paying a loan, so it's gotta be advantageous to do it this way.
and another thing I just personally wondered as I was looking at this is how escrow funds would typically be managed in this context, whether or not for a single development, it's common to pull those into one account. I don't know.
Well, that's what I was wondering too, is are you gonna take a surety bond out for each one of these?
Yeah.
Right, that would
And this-
pose.
Yeah.
The statute contemplates that you could do that, or you could do this kind of blanket bond structure that would cover multiple units. I would say, let me flip back to. So even in that instance, if you have these large deposits that are put into a pooled account just for purposes of this development, I don't think that kicks into your subsection C here, because this is purely being a pooled account is not what triggers it. It's that if a deposit is not reasonably expected to earn that interest, it's placed into that pooled account and directed that the interest be remitted to VHFA. So it's not just any pooled account generates this. There are conditions that attach. So I think I'm now understanding the risk more, but I still feel that it's not necessary. I mean,
So for clarity then, these are small deposits made for short-term amounts, like a quick purchase and sale, purchase. And then in the other hand, we're looking at much larger deposits for a long-term building project, so that it would. And so in that case, in the first case, they would earn very little interest because it's only going to be in an account for a short time and wouldn't earn much interest. But there's other scenario is it's a large deposit and it's a long-term project. So that larger deposit with a long-term project doesn't fit into that. But
Right, that's to say that C does have these additional conditions. It's not simply any pooled account. I can't speak to the empirical situation, but that sounds reasonable to me is what I would say.
C is more for people that are purchasing a home that's already built. Not putting a down payment on a home that's not built yet. Usually they'll hire a contractor to do.
Let me jump back to, yeah,
I don't think that's needed.
you don't need to.
okay, that was the way that I felt, but I'm glad I at least now understand what the potential risk was. It's this kind of overdrawing concern. And I can, since I'll be pulling this out anyway, I can think about it a little bit more and just see if anything occurs to me, but I think, yeah, I think it's okay. The next piece, I don't know that there was agreement across the group on this point, but just wanted to include as placeholder for your consideration, this highlighted language here. So under subdivision 2, the surety bond shall be payable under the terms of the bond, which shall be consistent with the terms of the agreement for purchaser reservation. So there was a concern that if the terms of the bond themselves did not match what was set out in that purchase agreement, that then the purchaser might not be in a position to claim return of those funds. I would guess there are probably practical constraints in place that stop that from happening, but that's a guess. If you wanted to just ensure that it is the case that the terms of the bond do match the obligations imposed in that purchase or reservation agreement, you could have language like this. If you find this attractive, I will say this is relatively weak. It just says consistent with. It doesn't say exhaustive of. In part, I put that here because I don't want to prescribe what the terms of the bond would be overall. So perhaps all the terms of the bond need to say are shall return the deposit in condition 1 and condition 2, whereas a purchase agreement has all kinds of obligations potentially set out, and I don't want to accidentally pull those into that surety bond. So that's why I have this kind of weaker language. It is a deliberate decision, but if you wanted to boost that up in some other way, it might be something to think about. But again, I don't know if this language is attractive to the group as a whole. It's just something that I had heard as a particular concern.
But I don't think we need it. And when you read the first line, the bond is issued by surety, authorized to do business in the state in favor of the purchaser in an amount adequate to cover the amount of the deposit to be withdrawn. So to me, that says you have to have a bond that will cover the full amount of that deposit.
Right. So I agree. I would say theoretically where I could see the justification for this, although I don't know how strong it is you could imagine that the conditions that, let's say a purchase agreement sets out 3 conditions for when that deposit would be returned. You don't meet X date, the units are shabby, whatever it might be. And they set out these different decisions. And then the surety bond just says one condition, just says if you miss the deadline, then it's returned. So that to me is theoretically where this could arise. It sets out the same obligation to return that deposit, but the conditions that trigger it could be narrower. Again, I just don't know how sureties do that. I think it's somewhat telling that Washington hasn't included language to this effect, but I don't want to speak out on a subject I don't, fully understand. But that to me is where that concern would come in. I'm inclined in the direction that you say, but that is a policy determination. So,
And then the next line said the declarant shall not withdraw more than the face amount of the bond.
right, and the obligation in this case is to return those funds. So that's what this sets out. It sets out the obligation very clearly. It's just that, this here is saying a claim is payable to the purchaser under the terms of the bond. So that requires the surety to determine, they have to make a determination that is payable, and they would look to the bond to see what are the conditions under which it's payable. And what this highlighted language what it would do is just give some content or ensure that there's conformity between whatever's set out in that bond to trigger that determination and what's set out in the purchase agreement. But I'm fortunately in the position of not needing to make the call.
What would you, I mean, it's not gonna hurt anything to keep it in. Doesn't hurt anything to take it out, so. What would you like to do, committee?
It's, yeah. It's fine either way, like it's not adding a layer of. It's not making it harder to use the surety, it's not. It's not necessarily protecting the,
Does it
maybe
provide,
it provides a little bit of extra protection.
well, does it provide a clear, is it? Does it give clearer understanding of what legislative intent is?
It does that.
That's what I was thinking, just a little bit added text.
Right, I mean, it may have no effect, but it might be nice just to make clear. I mean,
In an era where we've had issues, it doesn't hurt.
Okay. I think we'll leave it in that.
That's it. Okay.
and that's
Okay.
the extent of it. So I can cut subdivision A2, that's the individual escrow accounts piece. And I will retain this language. You guys are comfortable with using the term consistent with, that's sufficiently. In that case, it sounds like we're kind of at a place now where there's general agreements. I will send this to editing after I make the changes and then,
He has an idea how long editing will take.
I mean, I could do that right now and maybe jump back in here if I can get something quickly. I don't know what you guys have lined up.
No, we don't have anything.
Okay, yeah, let me see what they can do and I can just walk down and talk to them and say, you guys want to vote, so.
Okay, good, cool. Thank you, John.
Thank you. Thanks, John.
Okay, so let's go off live and we'll come back when we get to hear from you, John.
All right, sounds good. I will do this right now.